Iron Man 3 is the conclusion to the Iron Man trilogy, and much like how Iron Man opens the MCU with its first film, Iron Man again ushers us into the second chapter of the Marvel Universe and second act of the so-called Infinity Saga. I remember seeing this film and thinking it was pretty decent, though admittedly back in 2013, this was my least favorite of the trilogy. The changes to the character of Mandarin was a big point of contention to me initially, and while I now think Shane Black was the right choice for the film, at the time the director shift from Jon Favreau's popcorn style to the slightly darker take Shane Black wanted to tackle may have been a bit jarring for me. Again, this was the third film in a trilogy, otherwise helmed by Jon Favreau, and the first of the Marvel films to kind of have a dark side following the overall bright and enjoyable Phase 1. Following Phase 1's distribution deal with Paramount Pictures, Disney wanted to move the distribution house, and Marvel was no longer in need of a distribution partner since Disney bought out the company back in 2009, though Marvel was still obligated to work with the partners it established back with the first Iron Man film through Avengers, with Disney still having to fork over north of $100 million to have the rights to the characters established. Following Phase 1, back fully under the Disney umbrella from a distribution standpoint. It's worth noting this was a different deal than, say, Sony's with Spider-Man more recently, as it only has to do with distribution rights rather than IP rights creatively, which Sony has over the Spider-Man characters. Hence why the Hulk at the time still needed to be under the Universal umbrella, hence the Incredible Hulk being under Universal's distribution system rather than Paramount's. The legality is odd and really goes back to when Marvel first licensed its characters to keep the lights on, back with the first Blade and even before that with Roger Corman's Fantastic Four debacle. Regardless, Marvel starting with this film would mostly start distributing and releasing movies through their then semi-recent parent company Disney. Following the release of Iron Man 2, Jon Favreau stepped away from the Iron Man IP to focus on the then upcoming Magic Kingdom movie based on the theme park ride of the same name, though this would eventually be cancelled. That is a story I don't care to elaborate on further, but Favreau ended up stepping away and the search was on for a new director and new angle to take the character of Iron Man. Shane Black was picked in part due to his previous relationship with Robert Downey Jr., who worked with the director on his film Kiss Kiss Bang Bang back in 2005. Shane Black signed on, and the pair united to tie up the trilogy. Jon Favreau would also stay on as producer, consultant, and would reprise his role as Tony's friend and bodyguard, Happy Hogan, a role that he still holds to this day, most recently showing up in Deadpool and the Wolverine. Drew Pearce, who has sporadically worked in Hollywood throughout the years, was tapped to write the film with Shane Black, who initially was unsure of being more or less assigned a writing partner, but the veteran filmmaker relented after working through the story with Pearce for a couple weeks. Shane wanted to step back from the Iron Man vs. suit-clad villain formula Favreau did with the first two films, opting to make it less superhero film and more action thriller, taking influence from authors like Tom Clancy, with the project having a foot in the comics, loosely adapting the Extremist storyline from the Iron Man comics. As for the villain, a few people auditioned for the role beyond Ben Kingsley. As the face of the Mandarin at the time, the folks at Marvel auditioned a wide range of people for the role of the Mandarin, with Anthony Mackie, who would later be hired to portray the Falcon, trying his hand at the role. Of course, this probably helped him get a foot in the door at Marvel, and with his upcoming Captain America film, I am sure Mackie isn't losing any sleep over his initial failure to land a Marvel role. Chastain was considered for the role of Maya, but was eventually swapped for Rebecca Hall, and with the primary cast in place, the team went into filming. Filming took place from May 2012 to January 2013, and the film was put together for a May 2013 release. Iron Man 3 follows Tony Stark reeling from recent events in New York. His near-death experience to take down the Chitauri mothership had him shaken to his core, and Iron Man has become obsessed with his obsession of the Iron Man suits more than ever before, with the charismatic inventor creating a wealth of Iron Man armors and adding them to his arsenal, to the dismay of Pepper, who detects that Tony is starting to lose himself, compounded by dangerous encounters with him linking his brain to the armor.
Tony.
Meanwhile, Aldrich Killian, an inventor from back in the day that Tony blew off, has finally seen the fruits of his labors with the extremist property and his potential healing benefits starting to cross Tony and Pepper's radar. However, Tony is occupied with a new terrorist who is creating issues, the man called the Mandarin.
True story about fortune cookies.
The terrorist eventually crosses Tony when his friend Happy is caught up in one of these terrorist attacks and is critically wounded. Tony invites the Mandarin to face him and gives out his home address on TV, while Maya Hansen, a former lover of Tony's from the day he first met Killian, arrives to tell Tony something, and she may have, if the Mandarin didn't mount his attack, destroying Tony's mansion, with he, Pepper, and Maya narrowly escaping the attack. Due to this, Tony is casted off to a small town in Tennessee, a coordinate in Jarvis's controls due to the recent Mandarin attack there. With a broken suit and the world presuming him dead, Tony decides it should stay that way until he can solve his problems with the Mandarin. However, a local kid, Harley, meets Tony and allows him to hide out at his place, helping him fix his critically damaged suit with what little supplies they have laying around. Tony quickly runs into some extremist thugs and figures out that they're injected with Maya's extremist drug, and finds many of the extremist people he encountered were on AIM's payroll, a company owned by Killian, another person there the night that Tony met Maya. Seeing the connection, Stark knows he needs to meet Mandarin and figure out the whole story behind this, eventually tracking him down to Miami. There he finds a not-so-ruthless version of the supervillain Tony and the audience expected.
The Mandarin, the real guy.
Where? Where's the Mandarin? Where is it?
Whoa, he's here. He's here, but he's not here. He's here, but he's not here.
Rather, he was a bumbling actor. Stark realizes that there's no Mandarin, or at least not the one that was portrayed to the media, and figures out Killian is behind the plot. Tony goes after Killian, confronting him with the villain telling Tony he has Pepper hostage and injected her with extremists, her life in his hands, and at the same time he kills Maya, since she's starting to have a change of heart working with the villain after her compliance in the scheme and orchestrating Pepper's kidnapping with Killian. Meanwhile, Rhodey's armor is being piloted by Trevor Slattery to attempt to blow up Air Force One, though Tony shows up just in time to stop this, and the passengers, who are all jettisoned from the plane and almost perish, are saved by Iron Man just in time, though Killian now has the president hostage and tells the vice president that he will cure the vice president's sick daughter if he plays ball with Killian's plans for the country. Stark and Rhodey, now suitless, go off to Killian's location to save Pepper and the president, though this clearly proves to be a losing battle, that is until Tony activates a protocol, bringing all his old suits in as drones to come and fight Killian and his gang of extremist-powered henchmen. Tony eventually gets the best of him and Killian is killed by an extremist-empowered Pepper. Tony destroys all his suits, starting fresh, and finally letting Tony have some time away from his obsession. Tony ends up curing Pepper and gives Harley some new tech for his help during the events in Tennessee. As for the new characters, we have Jack Taggart, who in this film is just a henchman of Killian, but in the comics is a full character who has an armored suit and goes by Firepower, not unlike Iron Man himself. The character first appeared in Iron Man 230 from 1988, but in this film he never dons the armor, with the original character Trevor Slattery briefly donning Iron Patriot's armor for a short while. He was empowered by extremists, however. Another kind of weird thing is in the MCU, Jack Taggart is a white guy, though in the comics he's a black man, marking the only whitewashing I can remember in the whole of the MCU. Not entirely sure why they added this character to the film. The only thing I can surmise is perhaps in an early draft of the script, he was in his armor, and then that was cut when Shane Black decided he didn't want any armored villains, and the name was just kind of pulled through. I have no idea. Kind of a bizarre, light adaptation of this character. Aldrich Killian in the comics first appeared in Iron Man Volume 4, Number 1, and helped create Extremis along with Maya Hansen. In the film, Killian starts as a lonely, nerdy man and works his way up to an evil mastermind and gets superpowers from Extremis while running his company AIM, which in the comics is a major threat to Marvel, in the vein of Hydra, but more of a mad scientist angle. In the comic, Killian appears briefly in a single issue, committing suicide after selling his extremist formula to terrorists, so they really took this character and ran with him off of what little was really actually there from the source material, also adding a small level of surprise when the roles are reversed and the Mandarin is more or less a nobody rather than Killian. Maya Hansen first appeared along with Killian in Iron Man Volume 4 Number 1, and would survive for a long while, being an occasional side character in the Iron Man universe until Iron Man Volume 5 Issue 1, so more or less a volume. Maya was jailed for her involvement in the creation and abuse of extremists, but eventually would repent and work with S.H.I.E.L.D. for a while, under Tony Stark while he was the leader of S.H.I.E.L.D. for a short time following Civil War. The comics are convoluted, but regardless, she was fairly accurate. Mandarin, or Trevor Slattery, is the film's big red herring, allowing for the film's big twist that Mandarin isn't really a thing in the universe. This was always a contentious adaptation, since Mandarin was always one of Iron Man's big bads, and probably the closest thing he had to a real long-standing rogue, since many of them wind up dead pretty fast in the comics. Mandarin first appeared in Tales of Suspense 50, a little bit into Iron Man's initial run, but still pretty early on in the grand scheme of things, and he's basically a super powerful warlord who harnesses the power of his 10 rings and carrying on his supposed heritage as the great whatever grandson of Genghis Khan. Naturally, the tease of this modern version, where he is more of a Bin Laden-esque terrorist, is kind of fascinating. I actually never really got that mad about the twist. I mean, we were deprived of a more straight adaptation of the Mandarin, but down the line, Shang-Chi kind of sort of tried to rectify that situation, which sort of worked better for the character. I personally never really pined for Mandarin content. I just think he's sort of cool, but I didn't really lose sleep over the twist, honestly. Trevor is more memorable to me in hindsight than just some guy that shoots lasers at Iron Man for 15 minutes and then dies. Plus, the later version of the character that Tony Leung played was great, so fuck it, I'm happy. It worked out in the end. Look, I did this video in the past and decided to redo it because my first one was a little short and not very good, but what I noticed is there's nothing interesting I can really say on the inspirations of every Iron Man suit in this film, because while there are several new suits with cool designs, I think the film kind of just allowed concept artists to go crazy and create what they felt like making, with a limited number that seemed to actually pull from the comics. So what I'm pulling up here is the graphic on screen that shows all the armors as of this film. Pretty fun stuff, kind of cool, I guess. Anyhow, let's discuss the few notable ones that I thought were worth mentioning. Mark 15 is an adaptation of Tony's stealth armor, or the Mark 7 in the comics, which first appeared in Iron Man 52 back in 1981. The stealth armor works for highly serialized adventures in the comics, but I think the filmmakers rightfully assumes this would probably be the best chance to actually bring this to screen, because what situation is Iron Man really going to wear this in a film? Mark 20 is based on the then new Iron Man Model 42 armor, which originated in Iron Man Volume 5 Number 1 and was the main Iron Man suit during this film's production back in 2012. Mark 33 is the Silver Centurion, or Model 8, in the comics, an armor that first appeared in Iron Man 200. It's an iconic armor, but since the films mostly kind of ape off the more modern era Iron Man costumes, going back to the costume Iron Man wore in the 80s would not be super impressive to anyone but the comic fans. With that said, a cool adaptation and a needed addition so fans could see this in live action. Mach 42, Tony's newest suit at the time of Iron Man 3 and the main suit he uses throughout the film. This armor is visually based on Iron Man Model 37 from the comics, which was his armor in 2010 to 2012's Marvel Now reboot, a surprisingly long time for an Iron Man armor to stay in circulation, since the character's suits became fascinating to people like myself. Model 37 appeared originally in Invincible Iron Man Volume 2 Number 25. Both suits are more rounded and more gold heavy than old versions, though this film definitely goes further on the gold. War Machine Mach 2 was seen painted to be the Iron Patriot armor and is an all-around improved model to the War Machine Mach 1. And this appearance is based on Iron Patriot, which is an identity in the comics that was adopted by Norman Osborn, when he was the leader of the Dark Avengers, a team of Avengers made up of disguised supervillains, first appearing in Dark Avengers #1 from 2009. Obviously, due to the rights issues of the day, with Sony having a lock on Spider-Man and his IPs, Norman Osborn couldn't be used, so the suit was pivoted to fit for this film as it stands, with Rhodey as the suit's pilot rather than the Green Goblin. The characters of Iron Man 3 see a lot of closure from the first two Iron Man films, with characters such as Tony and Pepper getting some closure on the arcs of those films, with Tony not really getting another set of arcs for a while, until the two latest Avengers films, Infinity War and Endgame. Tony has PTSD from the events of the Avengers, which is perhaps a little jarring, following how that film ended, with the previous film ending with Iron Man and the gang eating shawarma, but in a lot of ways it makes sense. Avengers is the moment for Tony in the Infinity Saga, where the world takes a big step forward into grand world-shattering stakes, as well as Tony's, in a way, he feels like he might have ushered in. The Avengers were 4 warriors and soldiers: Thor, Black Widow, Captain America, and Hawkeye, with Hulk being a giant monster man. Tony was just a civilian a few years ago, and a worryless playboy, and as of Iron Man 3, he feels as though the weight of the world is squarely on his shoulders. He was never really trained for this.
How did he get out of the wormhole?
Wait a minute, Tony.
This causes Tony to make dozens of suits, start being slightly estranged from his girlfriend Pepper, and occasionally thinking of his own mortality. This obsession with being prepared for the next potential invasion has caused him to live in his own world. When Maya Hansen appears, Tony sees demons from his past emerge. Add that to the Mandarin starting to cause fear, a challenge Tony underestimates following the Avengers' big debut and Tony's growing ego. It isn't until Tony puts his real life first and sacrifices his suits that he manages to defeat Killian and change his focus on the next chapter in his life.
I guess I'd say my armor, it was never a distraction or a hobby. It was a cocoon.
The film slightly implies this may be retirement, though. Of course, his adventures would continue in the Avengers films. I like this arc. Tony went from self-obsessed in the first few scenes of his original films to obsessed with his suits, and by the end he manages to find a better balance. It's pretty well done, even if the Avengers kind of hand-waves the arc later on. Pepper is obsessed with the toll Tony's life has suffered due to his obsession with being Iron Man and what being a superhero costs him. This leads to some tension in their relationship. Tony is obviously unwell, which she sees firsthand when Tony, during a nightmare, almost causes Mark 42 to attack her in the dead of night. She's initially fascinated by Killian's process on Extremis till her meeting with Maya Hansen and learning of the potential dangerous uses of the theoretically perfect drug for regenerating cells from diseases and the like. Eventually she's infected with Extremis, and it's only with her help that Tony's able to overcome Killian, though superheroing is not for her, so she's cured of Extremis by the end of the film. Killian starts off as an optimistic inventor, one which is notably comically small and weak, to the point he is almost a cartoon character.
Advanced Idea Mechanics, or AIM for short. Do you get it?
I see that because it's on your t-shirt.
However, he eventually perfects the Extremis drug, allowing him powers beyond his wildest dreams and making him more normal, if not extraordinary. Killian is haunted by the denial Tony gave him at that New Year's Eve party years earlier, and has since worked to formulate not only his downfall, but also looking for revenge on a world which has been cruel to him back when he was a young theoretical scientist. Using Extremis to become the terrorist Mandarin, though notably, Mandarin doesn't really exist, which leads us to Trevor, or the Mandarin, who is the figurehead of Killian's plan, basically just a mascot to throw authorities on a wild goose chase. Trevor pretends to be a powerful, vain terrorist who can conquer the world after bringing it to its knees. In reality, Trevor is just a washed-up Hollywood actor who never made it, but is able to fade into his character and be fairly anonymous due to his low stature, sitting somewhere near the bottom of society.
They approached me about the role, and they knew about the drugs.
What did they say? They get you off them?
Said they'd give me more.
The cover even tricks Tony for a time, but ultimately Tony and the audience meet the true Trevor, who is vain like the Mandarin, but it's more for drugs, women, and the fancy mansion he's put up in over the actual power someone like the Mandarin could hold. Trevor is dumb and is easily manipulatable, something that flies in the face of the man of legend he claims to be. Down the line in Shang-Chi we see more of Trevor, but in some point in the future we'll discuss that. Maya is the brains behind Extremis, the other half of Killian's puzzle, who wasn't necessarily shunned by society the way Killian was, but perhaps fittingly had a one-night stand with Tony the day he met and subsequently blew off Killian. Maya sides with Killian, mostly wanting her Extremis work off the ground. Of course, due to Tony and Pepper's bleeding hearts, they quickly trust her, and that eventually leads to Pepper being captured, and when Maya is no longer useful, her death. Rhodey is back, and this time he's the Iron Patriot rather than War Machine, something the government suggested would help his image, much to his dismay. Again, he's a confidant of Tony, but takes a bit of a back seat, with Tony leaving to investigate Extremis and faking his death and all that. After the kidnapping of the president, he does reconverge with Tony to help save the day. Happy, similarly, is still Tony's loyal, if a bit goofy friend. While following a shady character that ends up being an Extremis agent, Happy is injured and almost killed, being incapacitated and leading Tony to call out the Mandarin, which puts the larger plot into motion.
My name is Tony Stark, and I'm not afraid of you. I know you're a coward, so I've decided that you just died, pal.
Happy is definitely more of a functional character to the plot, but charming as ever. Harley is the final character, and it's just kind of your generic kid sidekick that helps hide out Tony, and ultimately leads to him having an opportunity to go head-to-head with Killian. He reflects Tony a bit as well, being a young kid that tinkers, something that Tony relates to, causing them to grow a quick kinship. Though Harley only appears in a large role in this film, he does cameo in Avengers Endgame at Tony's funeral. Tonally, Iron Man 3 is primarily a dark film with Tony's mental state deteriorating and more gritty realism and personal attachment to the leads. It's certainly not the largest scale for a Marvel movie, being intimate for the franchise, which is still fairly large in scale. It is still a Marvel film after all. The film has goofy moments too. Trevor was a shocking twist, though he's certainly also one of the funnier characters in the film due to how odd and surreal the reveal is, along with Ben Kingsley just chewing up the scenes as Trevor. Musically, the film isn't all that special in the grand scheme of things. The movie's score isn't bad, but it just doesn't stick out. It was composed by Brian Tyler, who works frequently, but honestly, looking over his filmography, I can't really think of anything too memorable he's done. Definitely not bad, however, he doesn't have the voice of a superstar composer like Hans Zimmer, John Williams, or Alan Silvestri. Jeffrey Ford, who worked on numerous Marvel films, was the lead editor, along with Peter S. Elliott, who has been editing and doing effects since the early 90s. It's pretty solid. I can really only think of one Marvel project with bad editing, so I don't think it'll come as a surprise when I say it's pretty good. The action is well done, the story is clear, and I think the story is pretty concisely shown. John Tall shot the film, and he's worked in the industry for over 50 years. He's a pro shooting films like Almost Famous, Tropic Thunder, Vanilla Sky, and more, working across genres and attitudes. I think the shot composition is pretty great. Nice lighting throughout, much of the film, and a number of interesting shots. I will say some of Marvel's ultra-bright lighting and stage-like sets do make the film look a bit flat in some sequences at places like Stark Tower or Tony's garage, but for the most part it looks solid enough. I think this is also around the time a Marvel style started forming, hence the consistent looks throughout all the films, and I think that really started in the Avengers, which was somewhat boring to look at for me, and was really bad throughout most of Phase 2. Though I will say, when there's an opportunity to add some flair to the shots, it was added. Also, the CGI looks great in a relative sense. It has less CG than many of these films, but when it's used, it looks good, especially Tony's suits, which each look great, and things like the Air Force One rescue just look awesome and are some of the most memorable moments in the MCU for me. Iron Man 3 has an end credit scene that features Tony talking to Bruce Banner in something of a therapy session.
And the fact that you've been able to help me process
recounting the events of the film to Bruce Banner, who slept through much of what Tony said. While this is by no means a crazy deep end credit scene, it's meant to, I think, keep the train rolling on the idea of the MCU being this expansive shared universe beyond just the Avengers crossover films. It set the precedent that any character can show up anywhere. Nothing huge in terms of foreshadowing, however, it is something worth noting since it does kind of set up this new mentality that they start building on in Phase 2 of this fairly novel shared universe concept. I really enjoyed Iron Man 3, in fact, I really liked the Iron Man trilogy as a whole. I think there's a retrospective problem of Iron Man in that Iron Man just kind of keeps living his life business as usual after this film, appearing in a fresh new Iron Man armor in his next appearance, and being a superhero again. Like Iron Man 2, I think Tony is a character that always learned something in each installment, a new lesson, but always had to walk it back a bit so that he can start from Phase 1 in the following movie. I also thought the music was a bit bland, and Killian being basically Quasimodo at first, then becoming hunky Guy Pearce was a little cheesy. Though with all that said, the film has a lot of pretty moments, despite some occasionally flat cinematography. Tony's arc of letting go of Iron Man, at least for a while, was pretty sweet, not to mention the twist that Trevor was the Mandarin. It's pretty great. I love that twist, especially now that they did a fairly cool take on the Mandarin later on with Shang-Chi. The set pieces are crazy, and I think the airplane rescue will forever be one of my favorite moments in the MCU. Robert Downey Jr. and the cast again proved to be compelling in their roles, and Robert Downey Jr.'s darkness and charm he switches between with ease was a great addition, and I have to admit, Tony is such a charming character that you have to root for the guy. Overall, really liked this movie. Rotten Tomatoes saw a 79% for Iron Man 3, while Metacritic was at a 62 out of 100. Critics mentioned that the film had some flimsy elements, like the quickly dropped and perhaps dreaded kid sidekick. The relationship problems between Tony and Pepper repair a bit too fast, and the film just lacked some spectacle of the previous entries. The film, however, proved the new potential of the Marvel brand and made $1.2 billion on a budget of $200 million, and perhaps cemented the dynasty of Marvel that was only going to grow following the spectacle of the Avengers.